Service provider edge router market had a very strong third quarter. The market grew 17% over the last year, and so revenue grew to record levels. I think the numbers were somewhere in the order of $1.7 billion. So from a recovery standpoint, the service provider edge router market has done extremely well. I think that's an area where the service providers have definitely prioritized their spending, and as a result, we're seeing great market growth and a good recovery. One of the key applications driving the growth of the service provider edge router market in the third quarter were mobile applications. We estimate that about 15 to 20% of the service provider edge router market came from mobile applications. That's a pretty big increase from 2009, where it was well below 10% of the overall market. So what we've seen is that mobile is becoming much more of a factor in driving demand for IP technologies. About half of the growth of the market can be attributed to mobile. Something that we've seen clearly as a trend is that the operators are starting to spend on IP technologies, and in particular, we've seen that trend in the US, where some of the larger operators here are spending and investing in the IP technologies to handle the increased bandwidth and traffic of data on their mobile networks for the 3G technologies. But also, as we start to see LTE come into play, many of the operators are starting to put the infrastructure in place for rollouts later this year or even into next year. So it's kind of getting in front of the rush to increase data traffic, either from 3G or from the LTE technologies. The third quarter was very interesting in terms of vendor positions in the market, in terms of the overall rankings and the gains and losses in market share. The leading vendor was Cisco. Had a very strong quarter compared to the second quarter of the year. They had a very strong results from a number of their product lines, and in particular, we saw business in Japan pick up very, very well. Business in Western Europe was also very strong. So as a result, Cisco's market share climbed by about 4 percentage points in the quarter to almost 50%. So that's a very strong quarter for Cisco. The second vendor in the service provider edge routing market was Alcatel-Lucent. So Alcatel-Lucent went from third in the previous quarter to second, with very strong results in the US market, and predominantly driven by the mobile applications of some of the large carriers here. They also had some very strong results with some of the large Western European incumbent operators there. So that really helped them to get to a record quarter in terms of revenue, and pretty much sealing up the second position in the quarter. The third ranked vendor for service provider edge routing market was Juniper. Juniper had a very strong quarter with their flagship edge router product line, the MX. They started to see a very strong ramp in the new 3D line card technologies. So I think that's really been a strong point for them. Their growth quarter on quarter was not as strong as the top two vendors, so they did lose a little bit of share, but they are clearly seeing the MX pick up in terms of the types of applications and the breadth of applications where that product is being deployed. The fourth ranked vendor was Huawei. They've been in the fourth position or fifth position for the past several years. In the third quarter, one of the things we saw with Huawei was that much more of their business was concentrated in the China market. So as some of the markets where they've previously done well, some of the emerging markets in Latin America, Middle East, Africa have softened a bit. They've actually been able to overcome that with some strong business in China. One of the things we saw actually following the third quarter was that in mid-November, Juniper announced their next generation core router, and that's the T4000 series. So that is a new product with 250 gigabit per second per slot capacity. a big jump over their existing T1600, which is 100 gig per slot. So I think that puts Juniper potentially in the leadership position in terms of capacity when the product becomes available late next year, as they've announced. But I think one of the things that we're going to see is that Juniper's new router, combined with the new product from Cisco, the CRS3, which is 140 gigabit per second per slot product, is going to give the service providers an opportunity to upgrade their infrastructure to take advantage of the 100 plus gigabit technologies that will be enabled in both the T4000 and the CRS3. Not only will the operators be able to start deploying 100 gigabit Ethernet technologies or line cards and ports in their systems, but they'll also be able to increase the densities of 10 gigabit Ethernet in the products, which I think in the short run will be a very important factor. And by short run, I mean over the next 2 to 3 years, because 10 gigabit technology is really kind of the common currency in terms of operators or carrier infrastructure today. So we see more and more 10 gigabit Ethernet being deployed. So I think the ability to have, in the case of the T4000, theoretically up to 25 10 gig E ports in a slot, or for the CRS3, 14 per slot, is a big step forward for the carriers in terms of being able to add capacity in their networks to the same footprint where perhaps in the last generation they were limited to 40 gigabit, or for Juniper they actually were able to do 100 gigabit per slot in the T1600. One other thing that we did that occurred in the third calendar quarter for the first time was the actual revenue shipments of 100 gigabit Ethernet line cards. So we saw that Juniper was the first vendor to actually generate revenue with 100 gigabit Ethernet line cards for their T1600. So I think that was the first step in the market moving to 100 gig E. I think it will still be a relatively small market in terms of demand. I think it's partially limited by the availability of some of the optics on the line cards. But I think as we move into the fourth quarter of this year and into next year, we're going to see most of the vendors in the core routing space have general available products with 100 gigabit Ethernet technologies.